Hey, I'm Cheryl. I'm 32, living in a small city apartment a few hours from where I grew up. So, here's the thing my family, well, they've always had this, I don't know, perfect image of themselves. And somewhere along the way, I ended up on the outside. This story is about how I became the ghost in my own family and how I finally decided to step out of that shadow. Oh, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing that. So, okay, let me start by painting the picture of my family because honestly, understanding them is key to this whole story. My mother, Brenda, well, she's perfection to the core, not in a cute motivational way, but in this almost suffocating meticulously curated way that touches every corner of her life and, by extension, everyone around her. She used to be an interior designer, but she didn't just decorate houses, she curated lives. Every outfit, every holiday, every birthday, every career path, it all had to look flawless. There was no room for off the cuff, no tolerance for messiness, and certainly no patience for anything that didn't fit neatly into her vision of a perfect family. My father, George, on the other hand, was the calm, quiet backbone of this operation. He's a civil engineer, which, I guess, explains his knack for building structures, but when it came to family dynamics, he'd long ago handed all the reins to my mom. He was solid, dependable, but kind of invisible in the day-to-day orchestration. I always thought he was a good man, but he seemed to have ceded all domestic and social control to her, letting her run the show with an almost absolute authority. The centerpieces of their perfectly framed family, at least in my mom's eyes, were my older siblings, David and Laura. David, the venture capitalist, always in sharp suits, always decisive, always the family pride and joy. You could see him and instantly get why my mom adored showing him off. And Laura, my sister, beautiful, charming, socially polished, married to a surgeon, another star of the show. Everything about them screamed accomplishment and approval. I mean, honestly, they were impressive. They were the perfect props in my mother's carefully constructed tableau. And honestly, everyone outside the family probably thought we were the model household. And then there was me. I'm Cheryl. I had a degree, a decent career that I actually loved, and a life I had intentionally built for myself. But none of that seemed to matter in the grand orchestration of my mother's narrative. In her eyes, I was kind of a loose thread, the quiet one, the one who read more than she socialized, who chose history over finance or law, the one who was still single at 32. I wasn't a failure objectively. I wasn't, but in the glossy, curated picture my mother wanted, I didn't fit. I was like an oddly shaped piece of furniture that clashed with the rest of the set. I'd always known there was a difference in how she treated me, but I hadn't fully processed how deliberate it all felt until years later. Growing up, our relationship was a series of polite check-ins and obligatory interactions. Calls from her were regular, but they always felt like boxes to tick off. How's work? Are you eating? Seeing anyone questions that were rote, almost clinical. She never asked about the details of my life, the tiny victories, the little discoveries in my job as an archivist, or what made me genuinely happy. It was superficial, a confirmation that she had met her maternal duties for the week. That was it. And over time, that distance became the default. I never pushed because I learned early that pressing too hard just led to awkward silences or, worse, a subtle rebuke for being too sensitive. Even the early years were like this, just on a quieter, smaller scale. I remember school plays where I'd rehearse for weeks, excited to share my moment, and my parents wouldn't show. There was always a reason, a last-minute emergency for Dad, a social commitment for Mom, but they never missed David's football games or Laura's dance recitals. Birthdays and holidays were similar. My siblings would get new ski gear, fancy clothes for events, or elaborate gifts, while I was expected to be happy with the bare minimum or a practical choice. And if I wasn't, well, that was my fault. Subtle, right? Nothing overtly cruel, just a constant, understated erasure. It made you question yourself, wonder if your feelings were valid, if your desires were trivial, if your existence was secondary. David and Laura thrived in this environment. Every success they had, every achievement, every milestone, my mom celebrated as though it was her own personal victory. I mean, she was proud, sure, but there was always this performative sheen. Meanwhile, was quietly tolerated, acknowledged only when necessary, and often overshadowed by their glare. It wasn't like I didn't try. I was careful, polite, agreeable. I absorbed slights, muted my needs, and adjusted my behavior to fit into the narrative she wanted. But no matter what I did, there was always this invisible boundary keeping me just outside the circle of true attention, the warm center that my siblings effortlessly occupied. By the time I was an adult, this dynamic had solidified. I worked in a city a few hours from home in a job that suited me perfectly: quiet, contemplative, and filled with history, piecing together narratives from old letters and documents. It was ironic, really, because my job was all about uncovering stories from silence. Yet I struggled to interpret the silence of my own family. The calls continued less frequent now, but still perfunctory. There was an expected rhythm. My mom would check in, lightly, ask the standard questions, and then end the conversation as if she'd accomplished a duty rather than genuinely connected. My siblings had their own busy lives. David with his investments, Laura with her PR gigs and social whirl, and I was in the background, always nice, always polite, but never really seen. The subtle marginalization extended to social situations, too. Family gatherings were always framed to highlight the stars, David and Laura. I would sit there, participating in the conversation as expected, playing the part of the quiet, agreeable sister. Comments about my life were brief, sometimes dismissive, often redirected to my siblings' accomplishments, my interests, my joys, the little personal victories that I cherished. They were rarely acknowledged. I learned to let it go, to tuck away the sting and carry on with my own life. But there was always this nagging sense of being peripheral, of inhabiting the same space as everyone else, but not quite existing in the family's main narrative. I remember thinking at times, maybe this is just how families are, because it's easier to rationalize than to confront the subtle, pervasive devaluation. The polite distance from my mother, the quiet favoritism toward David and Laura, the minimal acknowledgement of my own successes, it all became a background hum, a constant reminder that I was the one who didn't quite belong. Even when I tried to be enthusiastic, to participate fully, my presence was almost invisible. Like a character in a play who's technically on stage, but whose lines are never really heard. It's a strange, hollow feeling to be physically present, yet emotionally absent in the eyes of the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. And here's the thing, this wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shouting matches or overt cruelty. It was, instead, these tiny, consistent patterns that accumulated over decades. Missed opportunities for recognition, overlooked achievements, the casual dismissals, the social media posts I wasn't tagged in. The way holidays and events seemed perfectly coordinated around everyone else but me. It created a subtle, gnawing anxiety, an almost imperceptible tension that I carried into adulthood. I learned early that silence could be punishment, that absence could be a weapon, and that my own natural desire for connection was treated almost as an inconvenience. So when I talk about my mother's perfectionism, I don't just mean she liked things tidy. I mean she liked life tidy, the people in it, the milestones, the achievements, the social appearances. She curated not just spaces, but identities. And I, with my quiet nature, my independent pursuits, my lack of flashy milestones, I was always slightly off center, a thread not woven tightly into the tapestry she displayed for the world. My father, bless him, never interfered. He had given over control long ago, maybe to keep the peace, maybe because he believed that supporting her meant supporting the family, even if it left me invisible. And so that's the foundation. That's the context. A mother who demanded perfection in every detail, a father who provided stability but no intervention, two siblings raised as the embodiments of that perfection, and me, the quiet, observant, carefully measured daughter whose existence was acknowledged only when convenient. That pattern shaped my life in countless ways, conditioning me to lower my expectations, to question my own worth, and to accept a peripheral role. It made me careful, it made me introspective, and it made me an archivist, not just of history, but eventually of my own story. As I would soon come to realize, this is the backdrop, the starting point, and the quietly simmering tension that would explode in ways I never could have predicted. So, after all those years of subtle marginalization, something started to shift. At first, it was barely noticeable, a call from my mom coming a week late instead of the usual schedule. I remember picking up the phone and hearing her voice, but it was rushed, distracted. "Oh, Cheryl. Hi. Is everything all right? I'm just in the middle of something." I asked what she was doing, and she muttered something vague about planning a garden club event. It sounded off, but I brushed it aside, thinking maybe she really was busy. Then, my sister Laura, who usually texted me memes or little updates about work, went quiet. A message I sent about a funny article went 3 days without a reply. And when she finally responded, it was a single, almost dismissive, haha. Crazy. David, my brother, was never much of a communicator. So his silence wasn't alarming, but combined. The lack of response from all three made the silence feel heavier, more deliberate, though I still tried to convince myself it wasn't. I kept rationalizing it, telling myself they were busy, that life was hectic, that maybe my own life was just small and predictable compared to theirs. I went about my days at the archives, surrounded by centuries-old letters and photographs, piecing together the stories of people long gone. It was ironic, really, that I could find narratives in the silence of the past, yet I struggled to understand the silence from my own family. The unease started as a small knot in my stomach, then grew into a coiling anxiety. Calls remained late, conversations felt shorter, less interested, almost mechanical. I called my dad, hoping he would be the straightforward one. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. Haven't heard from Mom in a bit." His voice was hearty, overly so, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Everything's great. Cheryl, just busy. You know how your mother gets. Lots of projects on the go." He quickly shifted the conversation to my work, asking in a way that made it clear he wasn't really listening. That's when the first tendrils of dread slithered in. That old familiar feeling from childhood, the one I'd learned to live with, was back. The last one picked. The outsider at the table. The quiet shadow in a room full of laughter. It wasn't anger yet. It was a cold creeping, a sense of being deliberately left out. I tried to track my own thoughts, replaying the last interactions, the last family dinners, the last calls. I couldn't find any reason. Nothing had happened. I hadn't offended anyone, hadn't skipped any expectations. The last dinner had been perfectly pleasant, if a little sterile. I had kept my questions general, shared little, and tried not to draw attention to myself. So there was no obvious cause for this new distance. Each day without contact was a layer added to the weight pressing on my chest. I caught myself imagining all sorts of scenarios. Maybe they were busy with something huge, something I didn't know about. Maybe it wasn't intentional. But then, The rationalizations futtered. The quiet wasn't just absence, it felt targeted. It was a shift from habitual distance to deliberate neglect. And as the days stretched into a week, then two, the anxiety transformed into this almost physical tension, a pressure that made it hard to focus on work, on anything beyond the slow, creeping realization that something was very wrong. I found myself thinking back to childhood again, to the moments of subtle exclusion, the overlooked recitals, the small injuries to pride that never merited acknowledgement. And now, here it was again, decades later, in the same pattern, but amplified. It wasn't just that they weren't engaging, it was that they were absent in a way that felt purposeful. Every unreturned text, every delayed call, every superficial conversation became a puzzle piece I couldn't place, a code I couldn't crack. The silence wasn't neutral, it carried a message I wasn't sure I wanted to hear, but couldn't ignore. I tried to distract myself, to fill the void with work, to immerse myself in the quiet order of the archives, handling documents with spidery scripts from people long gone. I even found a strange kind of comfort in that. The certainty of facts, the narratives that could be reconstructed from evidence, but nothing could mask the slow, gnawing tension in my chest. My phone remained still. My parents and siblings remained distant, and with each passing day, the initial worry began to solidify into something heavier, more defined. It wasn't just anxiety anymore, it was the slow, creeping dread of exclusion. The growing awareness that the family I thought I was part of might be deliberately closing me out. It's funny, isn't it? How silence can speak louder than words, how absence can carve out space in your mind until you start imagining every possible explanation and none of them are comforting. I was trying to tell myself I was overreacting, that it wasn't personal, but even as I tried, the instinctive familiar ache of being left out was undeniable. And that's when I began to suspect that this wasn't a temporary lapse. Something had shifted, and I was left standing, waiting for signals that would never come, feeling the cold, subtle, isolating weight of being the one on the outside. The day I found out about the anniversary party I still remember it like a punch to the gut. I was scrolling through social media, just mindlessly, the usual habit to start the day, when a photo stopped me cold. There it was, a massive, joyful group of people in elegant evening wear, glasses raised, smiles everywhere. And my parents were right in the center, beaming, my mother in a stunning silver gown, my dad sharp in his tuxedo. Everyone looked so happy, so alive. And not a single trace, I wasn't there. I froze. My coffee cup nearly slipped from my hands. Wait, no. This can't be real. I refreshed the page. Same picture, same smiles. My stomach sank. I scrolled further, more photos. Laura and her husband, smiling arm in arm. David giving a toast. My parents dancing together, looking happier than I'd ever seen them. And then the empty space where I should have been. It was like seeing my life in a photo and realizing I had been cropped out. I was a ghost. Really. That's the only word for it. I felt the air leave my lungs. My vision swam. For a split second, I thought I might be sick. No, it's just a mistake. I told myself, maybe the invitation got lost. Yeah, that must be it. In this day and age of texts, emails, and phone calls, surely they'd have tried to reach me if it was important. But no messages, no calls, just this cold, glaring proof that I wasn't included. I tried rationalizing it like a good daughter. Maybe it was small, maybe it was just the four of them, just a private dinner. That had to be it. It hurt, but the mind clings to hope. even when the evidence is screaming otherwise. I called my mother first. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to cradle the phone like it might collapse under me. Her voicemail picked up. That same cheerful, slightly mocking recorded tone. She always left warmth in audio form, but fake. I left a message anyway, careful to keep my voice steady. Hi, Mom and Dad. Just calling to wish you a very happy 40th anniversary. I love you both. My hand was trembling. The words felt hollow, thrown into a void, like tossing a note into the ocean and hoping it would reach shore. I tried my father next. Same result. Straight to voicemail. My chest tightened, my mind raced. How could this happen? How could they celebrate such a massive public milestone and not even make a pretense of including me? The day became a haze. I buried myself in work at the archives, flipping through the personal letters of a 19th century woman who had been ostracized by her family. Her words, desperate for recognition and connection, mirrored my own feelings in a strange, almost uncanny way. She wrote about seeing her siblings in town, feeling invisible, unheard, dismissed. I knew that feeling. It wasn't just historical, it was alive, present, visceral, and all the while, the images of my family, celebrating without me, burned in my mind. I tried distractions, ordered takeout, started a movie. My eyes kept drifting to my phone, willing it to light up, willing for even the smallest acknowledgement, nothing. By 10 p.m., I knew they weren't going to call. I couldn't even convince myself otherwise anymore. The truth sat heavy in my chest. They had chosen to exclude me. This wasn't a small oversight, it was deliberate, and the realization was like a weight I couldn't shake. The next morning didn't help. Scrolling through social media again, I saw an album from the party. Each photo was a careful construction of happiness. Laura and Mom, arms linked, laughing, David giving a speech, the proud father beaming, my father looking like he was part of a perfect tableau, and me still absent. A deliberate omission. Every photo emphasized the completion of the family without me. My chest ached with the physicality of the exclusion. The world seemed to move around me, yet I felt suspended, caught in this bubble of disbelief and pain. I called my mother again, trying to keep calm. Mom, I saw the pictures, the party. You didn't invite me. There was a pause, a flicker, almost like panic, before she recovered her practiced composure. Oh, Cheryl, honey, the invitation. It must have gotten lost in the mail. I'm so sorry. And just like that, she tried to paper over the gaping wound with the flimsiest excuse imaginable. Lost in the mail, in an age of instant messages, phone calls, emails. It was insulting. I could barely even form words. You forgot I asked. Voice low, disbelief coiling in every syllable. You, Dad, Laura, David. You all forgot I existed. Her voice snapped, losing the feigned sweetness. Don't be so dramatic, she said. And there it was, the lie, the gaslighting, the minimization of my existence. The exclusion wasn't just real, it was deliberate. And the excuse was almost comical in its audacity. I didn't cry, didn't yell. I just said, "Okay, Mom," and hung up. The weight of it settled over me, deep and cold, a physical ache that pulsed in my chest. I wasn't just missing a party, I was erased, negated, made invisible in a life I had every right to inhabit. And that's when the full, staggering truth hit me. They had crafted an event that excluded me completely. And it wasn't an oversight, it was intentional, and I was finally seeing it clearly, with nothing left to rationalize or excuse. The shock, hurt, disbelief, it all coalesced into a quiet, simmering understanding that I had been deliberately left out, that my role in the family was not just overlooked, but publicly dismissed. And the silence of that omission echoed louder than any words could. I remember the call to my mom like it was yesterday. My hands were still shaking when I dialed, the phone heavy in my palm. When she answered, her voice sounded groggy, like she'd just woken up. And there was this faint note of irritation. "Cheryl." "What's wrong?" she asked. I could barely get the words out. "Mom, I saw the pictures from the anniversary. The party. You didn't invite me." There was a pause, as a flicker of something panic before she slid back into her practiced tone, smooth and dismissive. "Oh, Cheryl, honey, the invitation, it must have gotten lost in the mail. I'm so sorry. You know, just things fell through the cracks with all the planning." I wanted to laugh, or scream, or both. Lost in the mail. A party of this scale in 2026, and that's the excuse. It was insulting, almost absurd. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just hung up. Voice quiet and tight, saying, "Okay, Mom." But inside, a storm was brewing. For a long time after, I just sat there in stunned silence, replaying the conversation over and over, feeling the numb weight of disbelief pressing down. The thing is, this wasn't a new pattern. Childhood memories began creeping in unbidden, the recitals no one attended, the sports games I was told I'd be bored at, the vacations where my siblings got the brand new gear while I got the hand-me-downs, the subtle exclusions, the half-hearted praise, the careful curation of attention toward David and Laura. They weren't random. They were consistent, deliberate, and now decades later, the same mechanism was in play. This wasn't a forgotten invitation. This was my family deciding, once again, that I wasn't part of their story. I could feel the numbness lifting slowly, replaced by something hotter, more focused. It wasn't a wild, uncontrollable anger yet, but a simmering, cold clarity. For years, I had been conditioned to accept dismissal as my reality, to internalize it, to question myself before questioning them. But now, looking at the evidence, I could see the pattern in sharp, undeniable detail. The party, the empty spaces in the photos, the excuse that was so transparent it almost mocked me. It all pointed to one thing: I had been erased, publicly, deliberately, and with a sort of casual cruelty that was almost surgical. I started thinking about all the other little slights, the ones I had dismissed as accidental or me being too sensitive, the habit of being gaslit, of having my feelings minimized, of questioning my own perception. Because the people I loved refused to acknowledge reality, it all came rushing back. And suddenly, it wasn't just about a single party. It was about decades of being made invisible, of my life being treated as secondary, trivial, something to be managed or ignored at will. The veil had lifted, and the picture of my childhood, my adulthood, my entire relationship with this family was stark, painful, and undeniable. Sitting there in my apartment, I could feel the anger growing. But it wasn't chaotic. It was precise, measured, almost like it had been accumulating quietly for years, waiting for clarity. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I understood. My mother's apology was a lie, a performance designed to make me doubt myself while protecting the family's polished image. And for the first time, I wasn't willing to let it slide. The numbness had done its job, shielded me for a while, but now it was gone. Replaced by this simmering, focused determination. I could see the mechanics of their behavior clearly, and I wasn't going to be blind to it anymore. The anger clarified things. It revealed the long-standing truth I'd tried to rationalize away: my mother's obsession with perfection, my father's passive complicity, the way my siblings were elevated while I was carefully tucked out of the spotlight. I could trace the small, methodical decisions that had accumulated over decades into the big, glaring reality of exclusion at this monumental event. Each memory, each slight, each strategic omission fell into place like pieces of a puzzle I had been too polite or too conditioned to solve before. And as the initial shock faded, the hurt became sharper, more acute, but also more functional. I wasn't spinning helplessly in disbelief anymore. I was observing, analyzing, processing. The rage had a purpose. It wasn't just pain, it was a lens, a tool that allowed me to see the deliberate erasure for what it truly was. I realized I had been navigating a minefield of carefully constructed family dynamics my entire life, and now I had clarity. The exclusion wasn't accidental. The lie wasn't a small oversight. It was a deliberate act to reinforce a narrative in which I didn't exist, and the simmering anger told me one thing, loud and clear: I wasn't going to let that stand. Not anymore. After the initial shock of the anniversary party wore off, I realized I couldn't just sit with the hurt anymore. I needed to understand what had really been happening all these years. So I did what I knew best. I approached it like an archivist. I started digging through my memories, the fragments of childhood, looking for patterns, for evidence that could explain this, that could make sense of decades of subtle exclusion. I remembered school plays I'd been in where my parents didn't show up, citing some work emergency for dad or a social commitment for mom, David's football games, Laura's dance recitals never missed, vacations where my siblings got fancy new equipment, outfits, souvenirs. While I was told my old gear was perfectly fine, none of this was isolated. It was a pattern. I had been othered systematically. And now, looking back with adult clarity, the patterns were glaring. I began reviewing digital footprints, social media posts, photographs, public celebrations. At first, it felt mundane, scrolling through old albums, posts, and tagged photos. But as I laid them out chronologically, the reality hit me. There were countless celebrations, trips, milestones, and special moments where I had been omitted entirely. The ski trip to Aspen, a vineyard weekend, Laura's promotion brunch events that should have included me, ignored without explanation. And in every post, my siblings were highlighted, my parents smiling proudly, yet I was consistently absent. For years, I had tried to rationalize these gaps. Oh, it was last minute, Cheryl, you would have been bored. Or it's just a couple's trip, you wouldn't enjoy it. But seeing it all in sequence, it was no longer excuses, it was a deliberate, consistent erasure, a real-time editing of the family narrative where I simply didn't exist. As the evidence piled up, my shock deepened, but it wasn't paralyzing, it was sharpening. I started thinking about other, more tangible aspects of my life, the areas I hadn't questioned before, finances. My father had always been meticulous about money, setting up portfolios for each of us, sending out statements every year. David and Laura often talked about how well their investments were growing, how dad's touch was magic. My own portfolio grew steadily, but modestly. I always assumed it was because I'd started with less seed money or that I was making different choices. But now, with the simmering clarity of someone seeing a pattern for the first time, I realized I had never checked the details. I requested a full history from my father under the guise of wanting to take a more proactive role with my finances. When the documents arrived, I spent a weekend cross-referencing statements, line by line, year by year. My stomach churned as I started noticing irregularities. My father hadn't been managing our accounts equally. David and Laura's portfolios were full of high-growth stocks, aggressive strategies, impressive returns, mine conservative bonds, low yield, and then withdrawals. Large, precise withdrawals. Dates that matched up perfectly with David's first condo down payment, Laura's lavish destination wedding in Mexico, my father, the man I'd always thought of as principled and passive, had been siphoning money from my account to fund their milestones. I sat there staring at the spreadsheets, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was more than negligence. It was active theft, calculated, methodical, and completely deliberate. I went back to the social media and memories, overlaying the timelines. The coincidences disappeared, leaving only patterns of exclusion and appropriation. Events I had assumed were oversights were now part of a deliberate, consistent system. Elevate the perfect children, maintain appearances, quietly divert my resources and presence. My entire life, or at least my part in the family, had been managed, minimized, and manipulated. The realization was crushing, a cold wave of betrayal that settled deep into my bones. And yet, in that shock, something else started to take shape. A kind of focus, a purpose. If I'd been erased and exploited all these years, then I needed to document it, not for revenge, at least not yet, but to see clearly, to understand, and ultimately to reclaim what had been taken. Every memory, every photo, every financial statement became part of a mosaic, a picture that was both painful and clarifying. I could see how my childhood experiences of being overlooked, dismissed, and minimized were mirrored in adulthood through deliberate omissions, selective acknowledgement, and financial manipulation. It was all connected. The anniversary party wasn't a one-off incident. It was a culmination of a lifetime of exclusion, carefully curated, rehearsed, and enforced by both my parents and my siblings, willingly or unconsciously complicit. I felt a mix of grief, anger, and determination. Grief for the years of unacknowledged achievements, of celebrations I had been denied. Anger at the audacity, the cruelty, the precision of it all. But above all, determination. Determination to reclaim my story, my resources, my narrative. I began cataloging everything meticulously, notes on memory, screenshots from social media, copies of financial records, timelines linking each withdrawal and exclusion to a corresponding event in my siblings' lives. Every detail mattered. I was building a factual archive, a record that could not be dismissed or rewritten. Working through this, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I had always been the quiet, observant child, the one who blended into the background. That instinct to watch, to catalog, to analyze, had been honed for years in the silence of my family. Now, that skill was my tool, my weapon, my shield. I wasn't just reacting emotionally anymore. I was constructing a narrative from evidence, understanding the mechanics of my exclusion and preparing to act with precision. The betrayal was profound, yes, but it had given me clarity, and clarity gave me power. I was no longer a passive participant in the family story. I was its archivist, its historian, and soon I would be its interpreter, revealing truths that had been hidden for decades. By the end of that week, I had a complete picture, a life systemically edited to erase my presence, a career and personal identity consistently minimized, a portfolio manipulated, and milestones deliberately redirected to benefit my siblings. The shock was still there, but now it had evolved into a quiet, burning resolve. I had the evidence, the narrative, and the method to confront it, and for the first time, I wasn't feeling like a powerless footnote in my own story. I felt like an archivist armed with facts, ready to restore the record and claim my place in the history that had tried to forget me. Once I had all the pieces, the memories, the social media patterns, the financial statements, I realized that a confrontation needed to be more than just emotional. It had to be precise, undeniable, and on my terms. First, I secured my own foundation. I called my new financial advisor and explained everything: the unauthorized withdrawals, the mismanagement, the stark contrast with my siblings' portfolios. He was horrified. And together we began transferring all my assets to a completely independent firm. Then we also filed a formal complaint with the Financial Regulatory Authority. Armed with the meticulous evidence I'd gathered, I needed to make sure that no one could gaslight me out of what was rightfully mine. That was step one. Step two involved getting Aunt Susan on my side. She had always been the one relative whose integrity I trusted, the only adult who had ever asked me real questions about my life without judgment. I called her and explained what I had discovered. There was a long silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. That's monstrous. Cheryl, I'm so sorry. Her validation was like a balm on a raw wound. She agreed to be present during the confrontation, not as a participant in the drama, but as a witness, a quiet anchor of truth. Having her there made me feel fortified, as if the weight of years of betrayal might actually be manageable in the open. The final piece was the anniversary book, the gift I had made for my parents' 40th. Originally, it had been a thoughtful compilation of restored photos and historical newspaper clippings from their early years together. But now, I transformed it into a vessel of truth. I inserted new pages at the back, high-resolution stills from my mother's toast at the anniversary, financial statements with withdrawals highlighted in red, and a timeline linking those withdrawals to David's condo, Laura's wedding, and other milestones. The book had become both evidence and narrative, a tangible chronicle of decades of systematic exclusion and theft. I polished it, packed it carefully in my bag, and rehearsed how I would reveal it. Everything had to be methodical, calm, undeniable. Thanksgiving morning arrived, and I felt an almost surreal calm as I traveled to my parents' house. I wasn't nervous in the usual sense. I was focused. Everything inside me had been cataloged, arranged, cross-referenced. I was ready. The house was as perfect as always. The scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon filled the air, a manufactured aroma of familial warmth. My mother greeted me with a hug that was all performance, her hands patting my back with the same detached energy she might use to adjust a picture frame. "Cheryl, we're so happy you came," she said, smile wide but eyes distant. My father hovered behind her, looking relieved, a little guilty. "Good to see you, kiddo," he mumbled. Laura and David were already there, projecting magnanimous politeness, treating me with the faint pity one reserves for a familiar but inconvenient guest. I moved through the house as if on autopilot, complimenting the decorations, asking polite questions about their jobs, engaging with nieces and nephews in quiet, unobtrusive ways. I was a ghost, present but intangible, quietly absorbing the scene, noting the behaviors, the gestures, the subtle hierarchies. It was almost meditative, this calm, observant mode. I could feel Aunt Susan's presence as soon as she arrived, a subtle nod across the room, just enough to remind me I wasn't entirely alone in this orchestrated tableau. Dinner was served at 2, and the table looked like something out of a magazine, perfectly arranged, every plate and utensil in exact order. My father, predictably, stood at the head to carve the turkey, while my mother clinked her knife against her glass. "I'd just like to say something," she began, beaming at the gathered crowd. "I'm so thankful to have my whole family here today, all of us together. It's what matters most." Her eyes found mine briefly, a smile that said, "See, everything is fine now." That was my cue. I cleared my throat, soft but deliberate. "I actually have something I'd like to say too," I said. Heads turned. Curious, slightly wary. I wasn't usually the one to speak at these gatherings. I stood slowly and retrieved the anniversary book from my bag. The room's attention shifted as I walked to the head of the table, placing the book gently in front of my mother. "I made this for your 40th, I said, voice steady, calm, a collection of memories. Her face lit up, self-satisfied. "Oh, Cheryl," how thoughtful she gushed, leaning in with my father to examine the first pages. Black and white photos, early memories, historical clippings. They murmured appreciation, murmured polite comments. My siblings looked on, feigning interest. Then I guided them toward the back pages, the ones that held the evidence. First, the video stills of my mother's toast to my two perfect children. The room went quiet. Her smile faltered. My father's face turned pale. "What is this?" Brenda whispered sharply. I pointed to the next pages, the financial statements. Withdrawals highlighted in red. The timeline linking those sums to David's condo and Laura's wedding. "And this," I said, my voice calm, deliberate, "is how Dad helped you complete your perfect family by stealing from me." The house went silent. Aunt Susan's quiet gasp was the only sound. Everyone was staring at the book, at my parents, then at me. My father stammered, "Cheryl, this isn't the time or the place." I cut him off gently but firmly. "For 32 years, you've made me feel invisible. You excluded me, ignored me, and belittled me. But this," I said, tapping the financial pages, "this is not just cruel. This is theft. You used your position as my financial advisor to defraud me." Laura tried to intervene. "Mom, Dad, she's making this up." I turned to her, calm but piercing. "Am I? Or did you ever wonder why your wedding in Mexico was so affordable? Did you ever question where the down payment for David's condo came from?" David shot to his feet, anger flaring. "You have no right to make these wild accusations." "They aren't accusations," I said, voice steady, controlled. "They are facts. And a copy of this book has already been sent to the authorities overseeing Dad's work. They are very interested in his management practices." My father sank into his chair, speechless. My mother's face shifted from shock to flush of rage, her composure cracking. "How dare you," she hissed, low and venomous. "After everything we've done for you, you pull a stunt like this. You were always ungrateful." I laughed, sharp, bitter, ungrateful. For what? For being sidelined my entire life, for being erased to uphold your perfect image. You didn't forget me. You disowned me in that speech and in every calculated decision that followed. I am done being your ghost, your footnote. I turned away from the turkey, from the perfect table, and walked over to Aunt Susan. "Thank you," I whispered. She squeezed my hand, eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you." She replied. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The book had spoken, the truth had been presented, and for the first time, I felt a calm, unshakable clarity. The silence they had imposed for decades was broken, methodically, completely, and on my terms. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving confrontation was intense, but in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just emotional, it rippled outward, exposing cracks in the perfect facade my family had spent decades constructing. My father's career, built on a reputation of trust and integrity, took the first real hit. The Financial Regulatory Board launched a full investigation, going through years of accounts, transactions, and statements. The meticulous evidence I had gathered was undeniable. He hadn't just made mistakes, he had acted in ways that were ethically and legally questionable. Siphoning resources meant for me to prop up the lives of my siblings. Slowly, the news trickled through the extended family, and the ripple effect was palpable, socially. The impact on my mother and siblings was immediate and brutal in subtle, human ways. My mother, long respected in her social circles as the matriarch of a flawless household, found herself at the center of gossip and speculation. The perfect image she had curated for so long began to crumble under scrutiny. Friends whispered, relatives questioned, and those who had once praised her dedication to family now viewed her with suspicion. David, whose confidence and sharp business acumen had always commanded admiration, suddenly faced questions about how much of his lifestyle had been enabled at my expense. Laura, the polished, socially adept sibling, experienced cracks in her marriage and public persona. The veneer of perfection could no longer protect them. It was a facade, and I had pulled back the curtain. Meanwhile, I was reclaiming my life in ways I hadn't dared to imagine before. The financial turmoil my father had created became the exact avenue for my liberation. My new financial advisor helped me establish a transparent, independent portfolio that I controlled completely. Every asset, every investment, every decision was mine, with no interference, no hidden agendas. For the first time, I had clarity and security that was entirely self-determined. It was more than money, it was a tangible assertion of my autonomy, a reinforcement of my personal power. Each transaction, each carefully chosen investment was a quiet reclamation of the years that had been stolen from me. I also began to cultivate the space in my life for genuine relationships, particularly with Aunt Susan. Our bond, which had always been gentle but distant, flourished now that it was no longer constrained by my mother's curation. We started talking regularly, first through long phone calls, then through weekend visits. I met her husband, grew close to her family, and began participating in gatherings that were chaotic, imperfect, and warm. There was laughter, genuine conversation, and no underlying agenda to measure my worth or manipulate my behavior. Being valued simply for who I was, without judgment, without performance, was revolutionary. It was as though I had finally found the family I had always deserved, one that welcomed me into the narrative rather than erasing me from it. Professionally, I poured myself into my work at the archives with renewed vigor. The lessons of my personal life, the importance of documenting truth, of recognizing patterns, of questioning the narratives presented became tools I applied with intensity to my career. I embarked on a long-term project to digitize the city's oldest photographic negatives, ensuring that forgotten histories were preserved and accessible. There was profound satisfaction in connecting the past to the present, in giving voice to stories that had been suppressed or overlooked. In a way, I had taken the lessons from my own life, the pain, the erasure, the betrayal, and transformed them into something productive, something meaningful for a wider world. The legal proceedings with my father were slow and emotionally taxing, but I approached them with the same meticulous care I applied to my archival work. I had the evidence, I had the documentation, and I had a calm resolve that no one could manipulate or intimidate. The settlement, once reached, required him to repay the full amount siphoned from my accounts plus damages. It was a significant sum, enough to secure my financial independence, but more importantly, it symbolized justice and accountability. My parents were forced to sell their large, immaculate house to satisfy the settlement, dismantling the material symbol of their perfect, curated lives. That house, once a monument to control and exclusion, was gone, and with it, the physical manifestation of their imposed perfection. Emotionally, the shift within me was profound. I felt lighter, more grounded, and remarkably free. For the first time, I was not navigating my life with the constant need to anticipate or mitigate my family's expectations. Their silence, which had haunted me for decades, became a space of clarity rather than oppression. Blocking their numbers, which I did not, out of spite but necessity, was a symbolic act of reclaiming agency. I was no longer waiting for crumbs of attention or approval. The silence from them was, paradoxically, a gift. It was a clean slate, an empty space in which I could exist entirely on my own terms. My daily life became richer, more intentional. I had small, genuine friendships that were nourished through authenticity rather than obligation. I invested in experiences that mattered to me, cultivated hobbies that brought me joy, and allowed myself to fully inhabit my professional and personal spaces. I had been the quiet observer for so long, cataloging the lives of others, but now I was living fully within my own story. The fear of invisibility, the long-standing anxiety of being sidelined, gradually dissipated. Each day reinforced the reality that my worth was not contingent on recognition from a family that had never truly valued me. The renewed relationship with Aunt Susan was, in many ways, the most healing. She became a consistent source of validation and companionship. Her presence, reinforcing that family could exist outside of toxic dynamics. Spending Christmas with her and her family that year was a revelation, chaotic, warm, imperfect, filled with genuine laughter. There were no performances, no hidden agendas, no curated image to maintain. I was seen, acknowledged, and celebrated simply for being me. It was, in every sense, the antidote to the years of erasure I had endured. As time passed, I rarely thought about my parents, David, or Laura. News trickled in through the extended family grapevine, the public fallout, the social consequences, the restructuring of David's firm, Laura's marital struggles, my parents moving to a smaller condo seeking anonymity, but I observed from a distance, detached and unshaken. Their world had changed, not because of malice on my part, but because it had been built on lies and could not withstand scrutiny. I had no desire to participate in their chaos. I had my own life, my own story, and my own agency. Reflecting on the entire arc of events, I realized how much I had grown. I had moved from a place of invisibility and subjugation to one of clarity, control, and empowerment. I had confronted betrayal, cataloged evidence, and claimed both justice and personal fulfillment. My life, once carefully monitored and minimized by others, was now entirely mine to shape. I had the pen, the narrative, and the freedom to write it without interference. The ghost I had been forced to inhabit for so long was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who could navigate the world with both precision and authenticity, and who had found the family she deserved in those who valued her for herself. The lessons were clear truth. When documented and presented with care, has power, agency, and clarity can reclaim what was lost. And sometimes liberation comes not from changing others, but from asserting your own place in the world, fully and unapologetically. And that's the journey how I went from feeling invisible in my own family to reclaiming my life, my voice, and my sense of worth. It was hard, yes, but it showed me the power of truth and standing up for yourself. If this story struck a chord, I'd love to hear your thoughts or stories in the comments. Stick around for more journeys of discovery and resilience. Sometimes the most surprising truths are the ones we uncover about ourselves.